Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, a Disability Tech Talk featuring Molly Levitt, the Director of Remarkable US. I'm Jocelyn Cohen, Vice President of Communications and Engagement with Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation, or CPARC for short. This event is closed caption enabled, and I've turned on transcription. It's also being recorded, and I'll send around a link to everyone who signed up once it's posted. For additional accessibility, I'll share a visual description of myself. I'm a white woman with dark brown shoulder-length hair that's down and brown eyes. I'm wearing large blue-green glasses and a mint green long-sleeved shirt in honor of CP Awareness Month. Sometimes I may look like my eyes are looking away from the screen or that they're rolling, but that's part of my cerebral palsy. In case this is your first webinar or Disability Tech Talk with us, I'd like to tell you a bit about what CPARC does. Despite being the world's most common lifelong physical disability and affecting 18 million people worldwide, cerebral palsy is one of the most underfunded conditions. That's why CPAR funds research and innovation that will change what it's like to live with cerebral palsy. Last March, we launched a pilot cohort of Remarkable US, a disability tech startup accelerator that's part of the Global Remarkable Accelerator program. And through seed funding, mentorships, deep dives, and support during this initiative, we help startups bring life-changing technology one step closer to the people with all disabilities who need it. The world is not built for disabled people, but thankfully there are companies built for that purpose, and Remarkable US has already worked with them. They built to fill in the gaps, meet crucial needs, and help people reach goals by broadening access in every way they can. I'm thrilled to talk about technology, disability, and access with my friend and colleague, Molly Levitt, tonight. As I mentioned earlier, she's the current director of Remarkable US. She's a thought leader, startup founder, advocate, and forward thinker who earned degrees from Boston College and Harvard University. She's been through accelerators herself and maintains a deep passion for increasing accessibility and inclusion. So welcome, Molly. We've got a lot to talk about tonight, and it'd be great to kick things off by starting at the very beginning. So how did you get interested in startups in the first place?
Thanks, Jocelyn. Just for my visual description quickly, I am a white woman with dirty blonde hair, little past my shoulder, and I'm wearing a green shirt and a kind of gray blazer of sorts. Okay, startups. I actually came at this from a different way than I think a lot of people today may have. I have always thought I'd be a teacher. I went to school for teaching. I, got my master's in educational neuroscience from Harvard. And I just thought that the way I was going to work with the disabled community was through teaching. And a couple years into teaching, I realized I couldn't keep track of all the individual things that my students needed. And so I worked with some friends at MIT and I built some technology. That technology started being used by other people in my school. And I was out to dinner with a guy that I was just dating, and he invited me out to meet his parents. And I sit down at the table and I say, "This is what I'm doing, da da da." And his dad looks at me and he goes, "Oh, it sounds like you're running a startup." And, I didn't want to look dumb. So I was like, "Sure, say that. I'm running a startup." And I went home that night and I Googled, what is a startup? And I realized that this was the thing, that people create businesses and they see something that the world needs and they build it. And that was new to me. And so I started engaging in the community in a lot of different ways. I would go to events and, I would just write down terms, because like every new industry or thing that you do, there's a language of work. And so I would write down terms like angel investor and Google it and realize it's not, someone who floats down from heaven and hands you buckets of cash, although I really wish it was. And so it would be amazing. So that's kind of how I came to this space. That startup, ended up getting into Y Combinator, which is one of the best accelerators in the world. We moved out to the Bay Area. We did a few different accelerators. And so I really got to jump right into this world and to see it from a lot of different angles. But I can't say it was the life I thought that I would be living.
Isn't that the way for everyone though? I love to hear about people's different paths to where they end up because it's so rarely a straight line, and the detours are what make everything so interesting, even if they're not something you expect at the time. So sort of you kind of answered this, but if you wanted to delve a little bit deeper into it, how did you get interested in startups? So I know obviously you had the experience on your own, but what sort of deepened your interest in the area?
I think that there's something really powerful about seeing what the world could be and like believing that anybody could create a solution for it. I'm a educator by training, and a startup founder by accident. And I think that like the thing that I really loved about running a startup, which in hindsight, I've recently been diagnosed in the last couple of years with ADHD, among other things. And in hindsight, it's perfect. Startup founder is like amazing for someone who's neurodiverse because you can really hyper focus. But it's a lot of like, what do I need to know today to do the job that I'm doing, right? And so there's a lot of deep learning and a lot of action being taken. And I think for someone like myself who just likes to jump in and likes to figure it out along the way, it's a really great space. Now, startups can do a lot of things, and I think we'll talk more about Remarkable today. And I think there is a lot of people who come to startups because they have the problem and they think they can find a solution and they've come up with it. And they don't necessarily know the rest of the business, all the other things, the way I had to learn it, doing. And I think that you can come at it both ways. In programs like Remarkable, we can really help kind of create the container around these people. Maybe they're disabled themselves, maybe they have a loved one who's disabled, maybe they just are interested in the space, but we can create a container around some of those more repeatable ideas of running a business and bring it to the founders who are really creating interesting things.
That's really insightful and helpful to know because I would think that, if I was creating something to solve my own problem, would I assume that someone else has the problem? Maybe, maybe not. Would I assume that a product existed already? Maybe, maybe not. And so then people come to their business experience and an accelerator like this with different assumptions and thoughts about what's already happening. And how has that affected the kinds of conversations with startups that you've had over last year and maybe even right now as we're preparing for the next cohort?
I think the word you used is really good because assumptions is exactly what a startup is. It's like a whole bag of assumptions that you need to sort out. And if you sort them out and your assumptions pan out, then you run a business. I think it was Steve Blank who said startups are organizations in search of a business model, right? Like that's when you like cross over. But I think that there's a lot of ways that we as Remarkable help our founders test the assumptions because you're right. Like you may have the problem and it may be a problem of one, which means we should fix it and support it, but it may not be a scalable business.
Right.
That's what a startup needs to be, especially if it takes venture or angel investment. There needs to be a scaling component. And so to figure out that scaling component, Remarkable is able to provide, we provide paid user testing and we teach our founders how to run user testing situations so that they can understand how to do it and re-implement it. We're connected to a hospital network, which if you watched a webinar recently, the CPRN hospital network, our founders are able to utilize that. It's really important to us to be able to test those assumptions and to be able to work as closely to the community that you're serving, even if you are in that community, right? Because I think you're the one who says it a lot. If you know one person with CP, you know one person with CP.
Yes. And, you are an expert in your CP or your ADHD. There's a lot of overlap in conditions, but then everybody's different and experiences things differently, handles things differently. So, what might work for me with my type of CP might not work for someone else with the same type of CP, even if they seem to move just like me, based on how their body compensates for something. And so when you're looking at products specifically for a physical disability or products or services for an invisible disability, it's going to have to be customizable and scalable, and that's a huge lift. And that's why accelerators like Remarkable US are so crucial, and why I'm so excited about the work that we're doing. And so we've both used the word accelerator a bunch so far, but what exactly is a startup accelerator for anyone who might not know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of terms in this space that are specific to this space. And there's two that gets kind of thrown out interchangeably for this. They're not the same thing, in my opinion. So there's an accelerator and then there's an incubator. And I think they're often considered to be the same thing. But I think of them as separate, because I think of an incubator as like the incubator over the chicken eggs, like these eggs haven't hatched yet, but they have great potential. There's ideas here. Maybe they're figuring out what their product is, what their MVP or minimum viable product is. Like, they're sorting it out, right? And that's important. And it's a program, and it's a program that they run in Australia called Launcher. But for us, we are building in the US first, the accelerator. And so you can kind of think of it like the chicks have hatched, and now we're teaching them to like run and eat and whatever. This metaphor is going off the rails. But the point being is that like companies come to us generally when their product is built. Maybe they're iterating on it, but they have an idea of their product. It's built. It's potentially even in the market. I say potentially because some of our more med tech focused companies are doing clinical trials, but it is being used by people. And so we provide this container of $55,000 in funding. We provide 16 weeks of support and mentorship and community. We connect them out to folks in the community. If anyone is on here who wants to be connected and be a part of it, we welcome having you involved. But it really says, okay, we're going to take this company here and we're going to accelerate them so that when they leave in 4 months, they can go raise venture capital. They can, like, whatever the acceleration point is to get them to the next level, we really try to make sure that we can provide that container so that they can continue to be successful.
So you're meeting the companies where they are, and that's different points for different companies within the same cohort. And then they want to get from their point A, which is different depending on who they are, to their point B. And you'll help them get from A to B, knowing that that's a different kind of advancement depending on where the company is in their lifetime, and what they're looking to do.
Yeah, I mean, they're traditional startup journeys. And I think sometimes in more niche areas like disability or, other areas like that, the like traditional path isn't always so straight and narrow, but traditionally you'd come into an accelerator, demo day would happen, and you'd raise money from VCs or from angels. That's not always the way it will be, but really the most important thing that we can help our companies leave with is a path to sustainability. Mm-hmm. And that might look different for different folks, but it is a failure on our part if companies come through this cohort and leave and feel like they don't have a next step that can get them to be sustainable. Because we don't want to, we want all these tech to exist. We don't want them to have like great 4 months and then have to close shop, because we believe that the world should have what they're creating.
Yeah. I mean, just knowing the folks in the first cohort, I love them all. I want them all to succeed. I'm a big cheerleader for them. I know you are too. And I can't wait to have more people and companies to cheerlead for. So we say that this is a disability tech startup accelerator or an assistive tech startup accelerator. Can you explain sort of what disability tech is, if it's the same as assistive tech, maybe clear up any confusion that might be around those terms?
I'm not sure confusion clearing will be exactly what I'm offering. So assistive technology traditionally has been thought of as devices that aid aid someone in being able to access life in a particular way. That could be glasses, right? That could be a hearing aid. That could be a wheelchair. That could be a screen reader, right? That specific technology that layers on top. That and disability tech in some ways aren't that different, but the way we think about disability tech from the Remarkable perspective is like, we don't just want to assist, like we want to really think about like tech and devices that can make someone's quality of life great. It's like not enough to get in. And so I don't think we necessarily have a huge differentiator in what they mean, but I think in changing that word in the way we talk about it sometimes, I think we are saying that we want to go beyond just getting someone included. Like we want people to have tech and things that help them to thrive and have the full human experience.
I mean, that's one of the things that excites me the most about the work that we're doing, because, this and I know this, disabled people are full people. So our disabilities are parts of us, but not all of us. And they may affect the ways we do different things. And it's not just about like that Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid. It's not just about the things you absolutely need. It's also about the things you want to do to make your life as full and accessible to you as possible. And so I know that's what we're trying to achieve here with the accelerator with disability tech. What do disability tech startups focus on? And because it's underneath the CPARF umbrella, so do they just focus on CP here? I mean, CP is such a diverse disability, like we were talking about before, and then there are also overlapping disabilities with CP. What's sort of the focus disability-wise of the Remarkable US Accelerator?
Yeah, CP is such a diverse disability, like you mentioned, that we really will look at any company that helps solve a problem or make the lives of people with disabilities better. So we support technology for people who are blind. We support technology for people who are deaf. We support technology for people with mobility and communication and the whole range of the disabled experience. I think the nice thing about what we're able to do with Remarkable and I think what CPARF is able to do is to not have to like zero in on a specific thing. And because the diversity of CP is what it is, like that frees us up to empower so many different needs in the community.
I mean, that reminds me specifically of WhereWorks, which was in our pilot cohort last year and was created for people who are blind to help them navigate through the world. But as soon as I heard about it, I got really excited because it meant I could have navigation where I wouldn't have to divert my attention at all from how I'm looking at the ground and looking at all the people around me walking around New York City. And so it was an unintentional application for an ambulatory person with CP, but then it's also super helpful for someone who's a wheelchair user, doesn't want to have their phone out either. So it kind of feeds into exactly what you were saying, that either the condition co-occurs with CP or there can potentially be other uses for tech that was designed for a different disability. And disability is one of the most diverse labels in the world, and it covers like every kind of demographic and so many different conditions. And I love that we're tackling it from this wide lens, sort of in parallel with our narrow but importantly focused research. And I would love to see the ways in the future that the research and the tech interact. I'm not sure how much you could speak to that at this point, but I feel like down the line we may be able to. So that's also exciting to me.
I would love that. I think if we could just loop back to WhereWorks for 1 second, because they're a really interesting example. So WhereWorks, they give directions through what's called haptics, which is essentially just vibration. And I got to work with them last year, and they said something to me at one point that really resonated with me, which is like, the skin is one of the most inclusive channels for anyone, right? Like if you're deaf, you can feel you have a whole body of skin, right? If you're blind, you have skin. If you can't communicate, like there's so many interesting applications when we think about, hey, how do we get information to somebody in a way that's the most inclusive? I'm not saying like we'll be able to read from buzzing anytime in the near future, right? But I think that like when we think about applicability and we think about why this area is so particularly exciting, it's not just because we are able to create amazing technologies for the community, but it's in many ways also because of something what I like to call the Advil effect, which is essentially like people with disabilities are often the first users of the technology that like in 10 years, like we all will think is really cool because they need it, right? And I think there's a million examples of different technology that started first as an accommodation for people with disabilities and now is ubiquitous. And in this year's cohort, I see those companies too. Like I see the companies that are going to make employment for people with disabilities today so much easier, like so much easier for them to be included today. And I see in 10 years that like we all may change the way we interact with devices because of the work that they're doing.
That is, it's so awesome to sort of be on the ground floor or like the first or second level of these creative companies and get to have a hand in their growth and like watch them fly, to go back to your chick metaphor for a second. But we've been talking a lot about disability tech and like the different kinds of disability and what got you interested in startups. What got you specifically interested in disability tech? You seem to have a real passion for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different angles. I said earlier that I was diagnosed recently with ADHD and dyslexia, and I actually didn't know I had this issue. I had these issues as a kid because my parents were like the OGs of accommodation. Like my dad was a writer and he knew that I had trouble seeing spelling mistakes. And so he had found this, I assume it's dragon dictation, I can't remember what it was, where they would read my writing back to me. And I had that, when computers were like gigantic and
Yeah.
you had to dial up on the modem, right? Like we had those really early. And so assistive technology in a way by accident has been something that's empowered me to be successful without even really calling it assistive technology.
Right.
And I think like, my mom had ALS. We have a family history of ALS. If you know much about ALS, it's neurodegenerative. So you start with some accommodations and you end up with a whole suite of accommodations and ways that you access the world. And so really early on, I got to see like what the world feels like if you have a wheelchair, like what the world feels like if you have a communication device. What are the communication devices that are available in the 90s? We've come
a long way. We have a long way to go, but a long way since then.
We've come a long way. We have a long way to go.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I got started. But, I've been working at a camp for children and adults with disabilities for 24 years. I keep going back. I spend all my vacation time there. Like, it's just kind of where my heart is. And, I think earlier I said I would have never thought I did a startup, but now that I look at the role I have now, I'm like, my passion has always been disability. I learned education and I learned startups, and now I educate startups that are focused on disability. Like it's felt very beautifully full circle.
I love it. I'm all about full circles, and you're educating me and everyone watching this now or listening to this later on. So, I mean, you're fulfilling all of those different angles of yourself. So pivoting a little bit back to the disability tech, because it's so specific, I'm sure it comes with its own set of challenges, right? So what are some of the issues that disability tech startups face at various stages of their development?
It's in many ways, it's not super different from the general more like traditional startups, but I think that there's more of a hoop to jump over around convincing people that this work is not charity, right? Because building a startup, you're not going to build the company just without any support. Generally, you need funders, you need partners and investors and champions and folks. And I think we're working on it here. And it's something I take really seriously with this year of Remarkable, is thinking about how we can position our companies to be seen not just as this like niche market, but we can help change the conversation around this market. I think there's also this piece of like, everyone knows someone with a disability.
Even if they don't realize that they do.
Yeah. I mean, you could be sitting in this webinar right now and you could look at Jocelyn and I, and unless we had disclosed, right? Like, you wouldn't know that we had a disability because we're sitting in our chairs and you can't see it right away. And so I think that there's so many people that 1 in 4 people have a disability. Baby boomers are aging and they're going to require more assistive technologies. They may never call themselves disabled.
Right. People are really scared of that word. And I would love to have people not be scared of that word. And I've said this before. I'm not sure if it was, in this context, but I think what scares people about the word disabled is they're thinking of it like the first dictionary definition of it, which means completely non-functional. You disable an app, you disable a light, you disable power, right? That's the thing definition. And the person definition is someone who has a disability, and that can be any kind of disability, and they're applying the thing definition to the person. And it's one of the reasons, I know that I had heaps of internalized ableism as a kid. I used to not say disability or disabled, I'd say physically challenged, because my dad said, you're not disabled, you're able. And because he was doing exactly what I just said, right? He was applying the thing definition to a person without realizing that was what he was doing. So that shaped my language usage and my perception of my disability for a long time. And I honestly can't pinpoint for you when I changed it over. But I'm glad that I did. And I know that everyone uses different language to refer to themselves. And I acknowledge that and appreciate that. And I just hope that ultimately, when language gets accepted, everything else follows. If you can't even accept a word, the products and the services, like, forget about it. You don't want to think about it, And then I think that also other people are scared of what it means to be disabled, what it means to have a disability. And so they just want to ignore it, even like subconsciously. Like, they don't even realize that they're doing it because it's scary. It's not something they know about. And maybe they've also subconsciously absorbed the way that society looks at and treats disabled people. And they don't want to be in that light or be perceived that way. There's so much to build up through this accelerator and so much to dismantle in terms of perception, and they're all tied together.
They really are. And I think that I agree with you. I think that there's fear wrapped up into it. And I think, that fear is in a lot of ways, because you look around at the world and you think, how would I move about this world if I were in a wheelchair? How would I move about this world if I didn't have my sight, right? And in that statement, you're probably right, because we've created an ableist world that makes losing those opportunities really scary. And so my hope is that instead of people being fearful of it, they go, hey, if I don't want to have to deal with this, then how can I empower access points so that people who are currently dealing with this don't have to even consider it anymore? It's not a thing, right? It's no longer a thing to worry about because we've created enough access in our world that it doesn't feel scary anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think about access all the time, just in terms of traveling. And I'm so used to what I have to adapt to and the mindset I have to take when I'm going to an airport, when I'm in an airport, when I'm getting on a plane, getting off a plane, et cetera, that then when I travel with a friend and they see what I go through, and it's not really a lot, it's just very different from their experience. They don't even know what to do with themselves about it. Or when I was in a car with friends and someone outside made a very disparaging ableist comment, they were all so up in arms. And I was like, because I'm used to it, even though I shouldn't be. So the more people we can get into the fold that even if they hadn't considered disability outside of one person, to think of it from a wider lens, like I'm just the one person you know, so this is how you think of disability, but there, like you said, 1 in 4 people are disabled in some way in this world. Yeah, so the perception and the misconceptions that we've been talking about, sure, they come from a lot of different angles, right? Of the startup and accelerator side of things. Like we talked a little bit about maybe what the misconceptions that funders might have or the general public might have, but what would entrepreneurs have misconceptions about, maybe aside from or in addition to the ones we already discussed?
Yeah. So I think that there's this idea that you can't do good and do well. I think that and maybe that scares some people from jumping into this area. Maybe they think about it in different ways, but there's a couple examples of this space. And I'm not saying that there isn't like more niche tools that will never go mainstream, but like I said earlier, like touch screens, audio, Siri, like audio, things like that. Like, touch screens was created by a guy named Wayne Westerman. And he ran a company called Fingerworks. And he was getting like repetitive injuries like carpal tunnel and stuff like that from working. And so he created a bunch of touch products that Apple bought for an undisclosed, very large amount of money that now are what they launched the iPhone with, right? Like you remember the iPhone, the first time you saw a touchscreen, you were like,
what?
Whoa.
Yeah.
What is this, right?
Yeah.
And so that was an accommodation and they made money. Dragon dictation, which I talked about earlier, the thing that like read back my my writing, that was created for people who are blind to be able to interact with computers. They were acquired by Nuance Communications. Nuance Communications is now valued at 18 billion,
with a B.
With a B. Audible was purchased by Amazon for 300 million. Like there is opportunity here beyond just like I'm doing something good for the world. There is opportunity here. And I think I even sometimes felt this as an education startup. You go to investors and you'd be like, how can I possibly reach the goals of like 10xing, which is what VCs want you to be? Can you be $1 billion company? And like the truth of the matter is like, that's a little nonsensical and needs to be unraveled itself. But I think that like more people need to believe that this community that you're building for is teaching you what the technology of the future will be. So like look to them, look to disabled people and to say like, what do you need? Because like I said, like the company I referred to earlier, we may not interact with our devices anymore by looking at a screen and typing in 10 years because of the work that they're doing. We might think that that's like the dumbest thing, that we all have bad backs and like hunched shoulders from looking at devices.
Yeah. We can't predict the future, but someone's out there shaping it right now. And we hope that some of those people are in the current cohort or future ones. I mean, it's all really thrilling.
The founder of the internet, the founder of email. I mean, I think we could all wish that wasn't here, but the founder of the internet.
Email's helpful. It has its place.
I'm not good at it, but the founder of the internet, the founder of email, they all started as accommodations. And like, what would the world be without the things that, go on the internet?
What would the world, it would be much slower and paper-based, and that's where we would be. We wouldn't be
We
having
wouldn't,
this conversation, right?
exactly. We wouldn't have this webinar.
Building off of what you've been talking about, can you talk a little bit about like, universal design? So right now we've kind of covered how adaptations, because disabled people are masters at adaptation, whether or not we get credit for it. How then that feeds into universal design and how the interplays with each other.
Yeah. So universal design, and again, I'm not like the universal design expert, though I did take their class for a little bit. Universal design is the idea that when you're thinking about a space or a product, you're designing it with the most access points from the most perspectives. The curb cut is like the traditional example of this, which is like a curb cut makes it easy for a wheelchair to get on the curb, makes it easier for women in strollers to get up there. Like, I don't even know why, frankly, we need a regular curb. Like, they work the same, right?
Luggage. I mean,
what's that?
People with luggage.
Luggage, yes, exactly. And so it's the idea that in many cases, and I say this with a caveat because I've actually asked some friends in the disabled community that are blind and said, should there not exist assistive technology? Should everything just have an access point? And they pushed back. They said, no, because as things become more universal, they become less customizable. And I felt like that was a fair reaction. But I do think that there's a lot to be learned from that principle. And it's not necessarily about universal design, but my professor shared it in the same vein many, many years ago. But, I took a class with a gentleman named Todd Rose, and he wrote a book called The End of Average. And it's a very interesting book. But one of the stories he tells is like in the 1950s, all of a sudden, all the like military planes started crashing, and they couldn't figure out like why these planes were crashing left and right. And so first they blamed the pilot error, of course, but it was happening too often for that to be a thing. And so they started looking at their pilots, and they realized these pilots were flying planes that were built in 1920 that were built from measurements of a 1920s pilot, and it was 30 years later and bodies were different. And so they were like, okay, we need to take new measurements and make a new average, right? And so they took 10 body measurements and they created the new average. And then they looked at all the pilots and they said, okay, probably 50 to 70% of these pilots will be able to fly the planes with the new average. Do you know how many pilots were in that average?
Not a lot, probably like 10.
0.
Oh,
0.
Well, that's a lot less than 10.
And so what the Navy had to do, or the Air Force, I can't remember which branch, one of them, what they had to do was they had to start making pilot seats and cockpits that could be moved and changed and bent. Right, we do that in our cars now. Like, it's obvious. The way you might drive a car would be totally different than the way I might drive a car. But the point is like, we've learned a really long time ago that average doesn't exist. And so what universal design thinks about is like, what are the different access points for everyone? Like, if I access this with a screen reader, could I read it? If I access this with limited mobility, could I access it? If I want to get in this building, could I get in with a walker, a wheelchair, with my legs, with like my guide dog? Like, right, what are the different human things that might create an access problem, and how do we think about them? And it was going to cost them tons of money to make customizable planes, and they did it because they can't kill pilots left and right, right? Like, they did it. And I think that we all can do it.
I have hope that because the baby boomer generation is so huge, that maybe we're in for a sea change as far as that goes. There was a recent article in the New York Times And now I can't remember the man's name, but I think he actually had ALS, interestingly enough. But before he had ALS, this architect created a house that was universally designed because he just thought that was necessary. And so I wish I could remember his name right now, but I think if you go onto the New York Times, or if you Google like New York Times article and Universal Design House, which I think he ended up needing because he then became disabled, you will find this article. It was within the last month, I think. And it just goes to show that when you really plan for things, it makes things easier and takes a lot of stress out, and it may cost an amount of money up front, but the ultimate cost is going to be a lot less, whether it's monetary or lives, like you were just talking about.
And it is in many ways lives, right?
It's like different lives in different
participation.
aspects. Yes.
Yeah.
Michael sharing with us that man's name is Mark Harrison. So please Google Mark Harrison to find the article that I just mentioned. And it was written by Penelope Green. Thank you so much for the assist on that. It was a great article. I think I gifted the link to my colleagues because I wanted everybody to read it. We may have even quoted it in a post at the time. And speaking of all of this, we were just talking about access and design, how can we lessen the fight that people have to have for access through the innovations we're funding, or just even having conversations like this? I mean, thinking about a world even before elevators existed, and now everyone uses an elevator, whether or not you have a mobility issue, even though sometimes people might give you side eye if you're going up or down one floor. How do we help in the fight for access through technology?
Totally. I mean, I think everyone on this call, regardless of what your job is or what you do, has the opportunity for that. I mean, I think about like the ways I can show up as an ally for my friends who have mobility issues is to like look at the places I go and say, like, could they get in here? And if they can't, to like say, hey, like, what are you doing about this? I'd love to bring my friends here, but I can't. And so maybe I won't come, right? Like we all have an opportunity, whether it's our disability or not, whether it's our, need or not, to be an advocate.
That's right. And one of the things that I learned just from my parents growing up is to be my own advocate. I'm fortunate enough that I can be. And I've been in situations. There was a restaurant I went to probably 4 years ago. There were stairs in the front, no railing, and I could do stairs with a railing, but there was the universal disability sign right next to the stairs, but with no indication of what that meant. Didn't say to call in, didn't say go around for a ramp, didn't say anything. And so went up the stairs, had my dinner, and on the way out, I said something to them. It's like, you can't have that sign out there without instructions. And they're like, well, you have to call inside. I said, how would I know what to do with that? Just going back to the accelerator for a second, we're talking about all these needs and all these issues. And being disabled is really expensive. And that cost varies from disability to disability, obviously. So how is Remarkable US addressing the affordability issue with the companies that are in like this cohort, past cohort, and future cohorts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because you're right, it's expensive to be disabled. And it is one of our core values that the companies that go through Remarkable create affordable technology. That, within what it is, like we're not, it's not in our ethos to support the technologies that are going to, try to get the most money they can for the device. And so that's one piece of how we think about it. The other piece is like people with disabilities are some of the most underemployed and unemployed community, probably across the board. And a lot of that comes down to a lack of understanding by employers of assistive technologies that exist that could make it possible for them to easily hire a disabled worker to do any job. I think that we as CPARF and we as Remarkable, we have a webinar series that's coming up around accessibility in the workplace, sharing out accessible ways that people can get into work, helping foster those technologies. I hope that we can also help move the needle forward on the folks that, currently can't access work and therefore, of course, like have to live below a certain level of income. And there's a million things I'd love to change about that. And I'm not sadly a policy wonk.
I mean, we can't change everything. And I was going to mention this a little bit later, but I feel like this is a great time to bring it up. You and I are working on something where I think disabled people could become a part of Remarkable and help it move forward. The Remarkable roundtables that we're going to be doing. It's not just that you sit and you watch and you listen with what happens with Remarkable US. This year we're actually trying to bring people together in either an in-person roundtable, which will happen at the Abilities Expo in Chicago in June, or potential virtual roundtables. So for everyone that signed up for this webinar, I sent a link around yesterday to register your interest for potentially being part of the Remarkable roundtables. Can you talk a little bit more, Molly, about what the disability community can bring to those roundtables and why they would be so helpful for the startup founders?
Yeah, so our goal with the program is almost every week, the founders are going to be talking to a group in the community. And they are going to be able to very rapidly get a bunch of feedback. And so one of the ways we're thinking about having these Remarkable roundtables is to bring people with disabilities together and to connect them directly with the founders. And the founders can share their product and talk to them about, would you use this? Why wouldn't you use this? How would you talk about this? How would you integrate it into the organization that you work with? Like ways to, it's not a binary, right? We want to make sure that, like I said earlier, everyone's building alongside the community. And if you're not, you're just building in your little tower and you come back down, at demo day, and all of a sudden people are like, what?
Towers are not necessarily accessible. So,
Yeah. We want to have these roundtables for that. And I think we also, like, as a community, want to continue to have conversations around like what technology should be in future accelerators. Like, what areas are you most excited about that would change your life in a meaningful way? Like, that's other things that we're hoping to unearth through either these during the cohort or later in the year.
Right. So the first few that are coming up, we want disabled folks to meet with founders, either virtually or in person. And then later on in the year, like Molly said, sort of, if you know of technology that you might need that you haven't seen, like raise a flag about it. Let us know. We can do the research and potentially find a startup that could meet that need that then fits into all the requirements that Molly was talking about earlier tonight. It's really a wide open space as far as innovation is concerned. And I'm particularly excited about the in-person one at the Abilities Expo in Chicago, but equally excited about the virtual ones because that makes it accessible no matter where you are to attend. So I'm going to go ahead and send that link around as well, again, once this webinar goes live on YouTube, but just wanted to give us a little bit of space to talk about it here too, because I think it's exciting, it's important, it's a way to really get involved and have some agency in a situation where you might not otherwise feel that you do. And I think that's quite crucial for our community.
Yeah, and I think, there was a question I think that came in before, like, where do you find the repository of every assistive technology startup that exists? And I don't think we necessarily have that answer yet. But if you are looking for something, we might know that it exists. And so I would just encourage folks, if you want to reach out to me or whatever, to say, do you know anything that does this? Like, the answer might be no, but that's good data for me to start looking. And if I do know, like, amazing, I'd love to share it. Now, I did say like 30 minutes ago that I'm terrible at email, so bear with me. But
Is
I will
LinkedIn
get
the
back
best
to
way to
you.
reach you then? Because I can do that too for folks if, I know you did, but you're pretty good at LinkedIn
Decent at
star over
LinkedIn.
there.
Yeah, try me there too.
And one of the other questions that came in, it wasn't directly related to Remarkable itself, and it also sort of dovetails with a question statement someone else is making about fatigue and disability. But that is it true that people with CP use 3 to 5 times the energy of people without CP just to exist? And it is. That statistic comes from the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine. And I think a piece of it has to do with muscles always firing and not really shutting off. And a piece of it has to do with the way that we move inefficiently when we have CP. But I say all this to say that, one of the technologies in our pilot cohort was something called biomodem, and it was a robotic exoskeleton to both assist and kind of challenge someone in their walking. So if you wanted it in the mode to make it easier for you to walk and use less energy, you could use up to 30% less energy, I believe, with this device. If you wanted to use it therapeutically to help build your strength, you could add resistance there. And so I know obviously that biomodem exists, and I love the guys at biomodem and what they're doing, and I'm very excited about this device and cannot wait for it to hit the market whenever it does, because I want to try it. But to say that there are people out there innovating in this space, we can't solve the entire fatigue problem that people with CP or other disabilities might have, but we can assist there. That's sort of where the assist part of assistive tech is, and then make it easier for you to live your life when you have 30% more energy to do so. So just keep an eye on what we're doing and take a look back maybe as well. There's a past webinar with Ray Browning of Biomodem that goes even more into the lessening of fatigue with his device. That was the most exciting part of it to me. Also helping with my balance a little bit, but really the fatigue. I hear everyone on that issue. And that plays, as someone commented, it plays into why it's difficult as well for people with disabilities to work. Like, even if they can physically get there, people might not understand that they're more tired, and they might not be forgiving or making an accommodation for fatigue, for example. So there's a lot of different perceptions we have to help change and maybe dismantle and flip around. And technology plays a huge role in doing that, with like each aspect of how we're trying to make the world accessible for people with CP and other disabilities can't exist in isolation. It's all about, how these different aspects work together to make the world more inclusive and more accessible.
Totally.
So we have a few minutes left here. If anyone else has a question that they'd like to ask, I'll give it a second for people to pop it in the chat or the Q&A. But I know that I've had a wonderful time speaking with you, Molly. I always learn something from you, really. And tonight I feel like I learned a ton. So I really appreciate your time. And I just wanted to let you know that this is not the last you'll hear from Molly. The first podcast episode of our second season features her, and it's a great one. I got to listen in on it. It covers even more angles of the disability tech space than we got to tonight. So make sure you're subscribed to Changing What's Possible, the Disability Innovation Podcast, on your favorite platforms, so that you can hear Molly's take on all of this when her episode comes out. As I said, I will go ahead and email around the link to this once it is live, and I will go ahead and email the roundtable link once it is live as well. Before I fully close it out, someone asked if you can see, Molly, how ADHD can relate to CP with any kind of tech solution? Like, do you see I think I'm reading it as, do you see a technological solution that could help someone with both a physical and non-physical disability at the same time?
I do, certainly. One really simple example that Jocelyn mentioned about fatigue is, I totally burnt out of a job a couple of years ago, and I actually had to take a lot of time off work, and that's when I got diagnosed with ADHD. And I was recently looking at the Job Accommodation Network, which you can go and you can look at by disability. It'll tell you accommodations for it. And I said, what would someone accommodate for ADHD? And in like true call out fashion, it was like people with ADHD may tend to hyper focus and overwork, and then their bosses give them more work because they're high achievers, and then they burn out, right? And I think that while it's not mobility that eases necessarily my life, it is certainly understanding ways to decrease how hard something is for me. And I think that there are solutions that can do both. Some of the things that would decrease my difficulty doing certain things also are things that would be overlapping with like folks who maybe use a screen reader, or folks who maybe need to access their devices through different inputs, right? I think the overlaps happen, and they're so specific to every startup that I'm sure I could make a million. But I think I do also, as someone with ADHD and learning disabilities, tend to have a high level of fatigue, not in the same way, but in different ways. And managing that is definitely something that I work on consistently.
And energy is energy. I mean, I recently learned that, and I hope this is accurate, but that the brain is the organ that uses the most energy. So we may even feel fatigue in similar ways and not realize it because we only know our own experiences. And I think that's a good kind of circle to close here, because everyone has their own experiences. They bring their own perspective and own expertise to the startup that they may create, to the accelerator that they're a part of, to the roundtable that they're in discussion with. And we need all those perspectives to make the world more open, more inclusive, more accessible for people with all kinds of disabilities. We've hit time tonight. I appreciate everyone coming. I appreciate your time again, Molly. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thanks everyone for joining.